Okay, so we're going to be going to the next session now, which is a conversation with Jeremy. So everyone here probably knows Jeremy. He's been organizing the Karl Popper Zoom conferences since spring 2021, twice a year. And everyone probably also knows Luke Castelline as well. So he's the administrator for the Karl Popper Facebook page. So Luke, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Jeremy, for being here. And of course, the public too, because there are some interesting people in the public. I just want to say that Jeremy is not also my teacher because he gives courses about critical rationalism. This is his book that mainly we will talk about, the philosophy of Karl Popper. He also wrote another book, which unfortunately I have not been able to read, being his worst student ever. And this is his book on Hayek, which I haven't read yet, but I haven't read anything about Hayek, maybe because I was a bit prejudiced against him. He also compiled together with Piers Norris this famous book of Popper, After the Object Society, which is great, which comes from the archives. And he wrote, amongst many other things, a chapter in this book, and also the introduction together with Jeffrey Stokes. And the chapter in this book is like a very short version of his book on Popper. Yes. So Jeremy, so I want to say we will start with questions for Jeremy, and people can ask after he answered, can make some remarks or ask something. And after a while, we will open the debate completely for everything. But now they can only ask something about what we were talking about at this moment, but it won't last very long. Well, it depends on Jeremy. Maybe he has some very interesting things to say. So Jeremy, you're still there?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Jeremy, so the first thing I would like to ask you is your story. How did you come to be interested in Popper? Yes.
Well, the story is a slightly peculiar one. I went to the London School of Economics to take a BSc Econ degree, and I was expecting to specialize in industry and trade. This had been suggested to me by our careers officer because at school I had, as one does in the one certainly did at that time in English schools, specialize in just a limited number of subjects. And I was specializing at an advanced level in chemistry, history, and at a rather lower level, I mean, still within the A-level set, mathematics. I went to the LSE and you had to sign up in the first year for a number of different courses. And I signed up for a course in Foundations of Mathematics, but I also purely by chance signed up for a course in logic. And this was taught by Alan Musgrave, not in the way in which logic is ordinarily taught, but really in the Popperian style as a history of problems, attempts to resolve them, and so on, in the course of which one was taught various techniques. And this really was interesting, whereas I think it's quite clear that had I taken a regular course in logic, I would have run a mile from it, because I mean, I took some advanced logic and it just consisted of a very able logician writing things on a blackboard, where it was never clear to me what one was supposed to do with these things. But at the same time, in the logic course, there were references to Popper and to his logic of scientific discovery. And I remember going to our library and picking up off the shelves the logic of scientific discovery and standing up and reading it. I found it really fascinating. In the second and third year, I specialized in philosophy and took epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of social science, history of science, and history of modern philosophy. I was in many ways introduced to a Popperian perspective by all of this and by critical discussions around these issues and around issues in Popper's philosophy of science. So, Luke, you were asking me about my reading of the Open Society. Well, I did this kind of incidentally, but my introduction to critical rationalism was by way of this kind of systematic course, which wasn't in political philosophy. I was taught by Watkins, by Lakatos, and also by Feyerabend. There was political philosophy teaching on the history of political thought, but that was taught by people in the government department, by people like Ken Minogue and Robert Orr. I also attended Michael Oakeshott's graduate seminar, which prepared people for Oakeshott-style research in the history of political thought. And so I had the interesting experience of attending Oakeshott's graduate seminar, but also Popper's graduate seminar. We also attended Ernest Gellner's lectures, I think, on ethics. I went on then to take an MSc in Logic and Scientific Method. As an undergraduate and MSc student, I attended Popper's seminar and what replaced it in the MSc year. The whole issue was a bit complicated because this was the time of the troubles at the LSE and there was a lot of disruption to teaching. But that gives you just a kind of brief introduction to how I got into this stuff.
You had a lot of famous teachers, and the first one is Popper, of course. How was he as a teacher? Can you tell us?
Yes. As an undergraduate, there was quite a fuss when Popper lectured. The room had to be cleared of smoke because he was allergic to it. I should say at that point that typically everybody smoked. I mean, I really didn't like smoking, but I somehow thought that as someone who was learning to be a philosopher, I should try smoking a pipe. And I got a pipe and some of this Dutch aromatic tobacco, but I liked the smell of it, but I found that the stuff itself had got a kind of burning sensation to it, and so really didn't continue. But the seminar rooms and so on were full of people smoking. Popper's lectures were recorded. Alan Gillis has written a brief memoir as a talk, the text of which is available on his website, which gives an interesting account of these. Popper's lectures were a mixture, in my judgment, between the terrible and the excellent. The terrible were those where he just asked for questions. And this, as I mentioned in connection with Yoski, seems to me simply not to work. I mean, because these things were recorded and then typed up, there is a transcript of one of these in the Popper Hoover collection, and this was just a one particular lecture, and it really is as dire as my memory of it was. But they were excellent when, for example, he gave us an account of the pre-Socratics' ideas about cosmology, of the problems they were addressing, of their tradition, of the preservation of their views and of their criticism. And this came alive, and then this, because he was presenting us with some interesting and contentful material, could then give rise to questions. Popper then retired, I think, at the end of my period as an undergraduate, and he spent a year, not a very happy one, at Brandeis. And it was over this next year, when I think I was doing my master's degree, when Feyerabend came to give philosophy of science lectures instead. Alan Gillis has given an account of these. My own memory was really very different. My recollection is of Feyerabend moving around, as Gillis says, dynamically on his crutch, but with at various points gesticulating with his crutch to emphasize points and so on, but with Lakatos going behind him and sort of writing refutations of what he was doing on the chalkboard behind him. I know people for completely different courses, I mean, people studying management and so on, will come into these things for the sheer entertainment value of the interactions between them. I then, after my master's degree, moved to Durham University Library. I was in touch over this period with my friend Larry Briskman and discussing philosophy with him. He was at Edinburgh and he urged me to apply for a lectureship in philosophy. I wrote to Watkins, who responded saying that he thought that someone from the LSE wouldn't have much of a chance. And at this point, it was perfectly possible for someone to get a lectureship position on the strength of a master's degree. Things have changed. But he may just have been being very nice about this. But he asked me if I would be interested in being Popper's assistant. And I said, yes. I mean, it's a little bit like a young Catholic boy being asked if he'd like to come and be the Pope's assistant. Now, I went to meet Popper, and he seemed happy enough, and I was appointed. And I then worked as his full-time assistant, well, more than full-time, for 8 years. I was based in an office at the LSE. My main tasks included obtaining books and papers for him. This, I should stress, was before anything was computerized, dealing with limited correspondence that came to the LSE in connection with him, talking with him on the phone about it, working with his part-time secretary on the revision of Popper's papers or on book manuscripts. I would also be reading proofs and things of this kind. And I'd phone Popper in the morning and at the end of the afternoon, and would typically then get requests from him of various kinds for materials to work with. Once or twice a week, I'd go out to his house in Penn, near High Wycombe, to work with him in the afternoons. And sometimes the work would go on into the evenings. And we'd be working on his lectures, on manuscripts and letters. As he got to know me better, he got me to undertake more extensive work for him, ending up, when we got onto the self and its brain, with him telling me about various kinds of ideas, my taking notes, my writing up things on the basis of that, which he would then work on and reshape. It would be possible, but I can't do it now, and it would really require that I revisit the work that Popper was doing over the relevant period to actually go through and do a kind of commentary on what was going on right through then. But I worked with him on objective knowledge, on the philosophy of Karl Popper, but where David Miller was of immense help to him, drafting a lot of material from him and so on. I worked on the revision of Popper's Shilp autobiography as Unended Quest. I worked on what became the method, the framework. This was just about finished, but his wife really said, no, I'd prefer you, Karl, to get on with your work on science instead. And so it was put to one side. And there was also work on an essay volume on philosophy and physics. This wasn't published, I think, really because there was the problem that Popper's substantive views had changed over time, but he wasn't in a very good position. And this was never really a very good strength of his to actually go back and adjust, to annotate material explaining where his views now differed from it and so on. And also I worked with him on the self and its brain. There were also many, many papers and lectures on all kinds of different topics. There was hardly any topic which Popper didn't get involved in.
Could I get back now to your teachers? Because the firearm did he use the Hexenhammer at that time? Or that was only later, probably.
No, I mean, what happened was that Feyerabend got to the point where he became sort of famous and he was being offered many different positions, several of which he kept accepting at once. But at one point, he accepted a position as professor, that's head of the department of the history and of the small history and philosophy of science department at University College London. That was the department that Larry Loudon used to be in. And it was about a 3 or 4 person department, very small. But I think Lakatos asked him when he was there, as Popper was away, if he would be willing to come to the LSE and deliver a course of lectures on the philosophy of science, because had Popper still been there, he would have been lecturing on that topic, but he'd gone off to Brandeis, he'd retired, and they hadn't yet got a replacement. So I was taught by him, I suspect probably in my master's year. I mean, I wouldn't swear to it. It was either my last year as an undergraduate or my master's year.
And like, for instance, Ernest Gellner, how was he? Because he was also...
Well, Gellner was a professor in the Department of Sociology. He was appointed, I think, as a professor of philosophy in the Department of Sociology. So he wasn't in Popper's department. He, I mean, he was doing research work, supervising and so on. He gave some courses of lectures, and certainly one of these which he gave, I think it may have been on ethics, we had to attend. Obviously, I was delighted to do so. He was a rather strange lecturer because he had for a long time over this period a kind of degenerative disease, which I think affected one of his legs. And so he moved with some difficulty. And he would come to a freestanding lectern, would stand behind this for a good while in silence, and then would speak to us. I can't remember if he had notes, but certainly my recollection of it was that he may just have, after a moment to pause and collect his thoughts, just have simply spoken extempore. He was an interesting man, but I guess I would say that when I was at the LSE, I found him, I mean, I went to public lectures that he gave as well occasionally and read some of his work, but he seemed to me always to be waiting for it was as if he wanted to make an important contribution to philosophy, which would play something like the social critical role of logical positivism. I mean, he didn't like logical positivism, but in his book, Words and Things, he had sympathized very much with the kind of critical and reformist spirit of that. And it's as if he was looking for something to play that kind of role, but it wasn't clear that he was offering it himself. And I mean, while he showed interest in Popper's work, I think one wouldn't call him a Popperian, and he had some kind of sociological criticisms of Popper on the of Popper's account of the Open Society. But he came across as an interesting man who might at any one point say something really important, but he never seemed quite to say that when I was in his lectures.
Yes, but Watkins was really a Popperian, I guess. Probably.
Yes. Oh, very much. I mean, Watkins was someone who had extremely wide interests. He had earlier on been in Oakeshott's department, that's to say the political theory bit of the government department, and he'd moved over to Popper's department. And he was interested in the history of political thought. I mean, he's well known for his work on Thomas Hobbes, but he also gave lectures on other people. He lectured when I was there on the history of philosophy. He basically covered the general philosophy syllabus outside of the philosophy of science, but he also had strong interest in the philosophy of science too. So Watkins, I think, was really a very powerful figure, and one who was very intellectually well-rounded, and who made very important contributions to critical rationalism, which I tend to think haven't been appreciated enough. As he got older, he got, I think, increasingly concerned that he wasn't doing more technical work, and kind of tended to move over a bit in that direction. And he ended up writing a big book in which he attempted to offer his own improvements on Popper's philosophy of science, but he also ended up, I think, writing a book about human freedom. And in that context, it's quite interesting. Watkins was the supervisor of Helena Scheim, as she was then, in fact, Helena Cronin, as she published, who wrote an important book on sexual selection with a biologist as, I think, her co-supervisor, and Watkins himself got very interested in evolutionary theory at that point. Helena Scheim was someone who, when I was an undergraduate, was taking tutorials to back up the lectures in philosophy of science, but she also then went on to run the Darwin Center at the LSE for a number of years.
And you, when exactly did you read the Open Society? Some years after you?
Well, I became I mean, the Open Society didn't play a major role in my development concerning critical rationalism. I mean, for a number of people, including yourself, and it appears also Ian Jarvie, it really played a crucial role. Well, I certainly read it, but for me, in many respects, it played second fiddle to the development of a broader concern with critical rationalism.
And you told us that Popper was, well, many people say that Popper was a difficult person. You don't say that, but you say that he was somewhat obsessive.
Yeah, well, look, I think there were different elements about this. Popper was friendly, kind. He put up with my mistakes and my ignorance very well. I'm just embarrassed thinking back to when I worked with him. But he drove himself really hard. And if he got stuck into some topic, he might regularly work on it right through the night. In interactions together, we kept strictly to work-related issues, and he didn't chat about other matters or reminisce and so on. I mean, he drove himself really very hard. If, as a kind of concession to his wife, they went off on holiday, one would very quickly get back manuscripts from Popper. So, I mean, for him, working on stuff was everything. One issue was that he was obsessive about his manuscripts, but where this often took on the form of his making small changes to punctuation. And the amount of time, I mean, they may well have been improvements, but the amount of time that he wasted on this is almost unbelievable. It was also the case that he was concerned about English style. And he regularly referred to Fowler's Modern English Usage for guidance. I mean, this was a little book on the shelf of his that he'd always go sort of diving for. But when he was writing, he'd become immersed in the ideas and his English style would lapse. And one of my tasks as his assistant was to read over his work and make sure that it was actually in English, that it was idiomatic and so on. He typically wrote on special treated foolscap paper. I don't know, he was given this at some point and he really rather liked it, a kind of small, a smooth covered foolscap paper. His wife would typically type up a first draft of this, which he would then correct and annotate. And it would be that I would then take back with me to the LSE. There is a risk that there was a kind of unending loop of manuscripts, changes, retyping. And I should stress, I mean, one feature of this not being a period with computers was that it was a matter of retyping. Another thing that I'd say is this: Popper typically took anyone who came to see him in a friendly way into the middle of whatever Popper was currently working on. And I think that he tended to see his immediate students as being kind of co-workers with him on various sorts of projects. So I think there were two elements to this. I mean, on the one side, he and they would work very closely together, but for the students, it would be something of a turnoff if they had interests which Popper wasn't interested in, where he would turn away from that. It was also the case that because I think there'd been this close collaboration, he then found people who'd worked with him in this way, making public criticism rather than discussing issues directly with him, rather difficult to take. This didn't happen across the board. I mean, David Miller worked fearlessly with him, put in an incredible amount of work on a voluntary basis on what Popper was doing, but also produced some really tough criticisms of some of Popper's work on verisimilitude, on stuff to do with content and so on, and there was no personal falling out. I was in a rather different category in the sense that I was registered for I think an MPhil, and then it was changed to a doctorate while I was with Popper, but it was on Hayek. And this is quite interesting, really, because while Popper had an interest in Hayek, he had no particular stake in Hayek or the interpretation of his work. And this meant that Popper was sort of friendly and encouraging, but there wasn't either this closeness of collaboration or any possibility for a break with him at all.
And you say some people think that Popper was somewhat autistic. Do you think there's any truth of that, or?
I have no idea, really. I mean, all I can say is that he was incredibly preoccupied with his work and related issues. Another feature of Popper was that he was rather deaf, and this would mean that if he was having a conversation with someone, Popper was very often actually having to try to reconstruct whatever it was that they might be saying and to respond to that. And I think that this might have had an effect of, in some respects, distancing him from them. And also occasionally, I mean, there was a discussion with John Eccles, which was published in, transcribed and came out in a book called Reflexive Water, where Popper systematically misunderstood questions that were being put to him. So I think that someone was asking him questions about finance, and he thought they were talking about violence. And so this is another aspect to what was happening. But I mean, Popper was preoccupied by intellectual problems, and it's also the case that, you know, his health, I mean, he's one of these people who lived in the end for a very, very long while, but his health always was reported as being precarious and so on. But if he went to bed, he would work on especially technical issues on the axiomatization of probability theory. And so, I mean, it provided, as it were, he was able to engage with things, there was really no let up in his time.
Okay, we now come to, because Hayek has been an important influence on you. I don't know any, I really don't know a lot about him. I realize I should start reading some of his work, and your book. Maybe I will read that first. But you say, well, can you say what affected your approach to Popper that you learned from Hayek? Yes.
Yes, certainly. I mean, this was something, we may go back to Popper's own politics, but the issues concerned with Hayek were really this. I mean, Watkins, I think, had suggested to me working on Hayek's Constitution of Liberty as a topic for a PhD. And I became interested in various different things. But what I really found important was essentially this. It wasn't Hayek's free market approach. I mean, I think this is important and interesting and so on, but rather what seemed to me to be important on what over time seemed to me to be an important corrective to aspects of Popper's approach to politics was Hayek's emphasis on the way in which institutions that we have and need exercise constraints on what we can also achieve while those institutions are in place. And so what you get coming out of Hayek is the notion that there may be all sorts of things which we would find desirable, and which indeed he thought were desirable, like a greater equality of income and so on, but where Hayek wanted to argue that we could come through the social sciences to discover that if we have other institutions in place which we need, these may be incompatible with the realization of some of the things which we think are ethically important. And Hayek also stressed the importance of theoretical knowledge of the unintended consequences of our actions. And these things, the character and ramifications and importance of which I've come to appreciate over time, seem to me actually to offer an important corrective to aspects of Popper's open society. For there is a risk that one may otherwise simply think that if there's agreement that something is a problem, we should just set out to address it by means of piecemeal social engineering. And this issue raised by Hayek's work is something the ramifications of which I've explored over time. Most recently, it's led me to the problem, which I think that while both Hayek and Popper would not disagree that there is an issue, that they haven't really addressed it, namely that we need to recognize the fallible character of theoretical knowledge about these things, but we may also need to appreciate that as individuals, we may not be able to understand the knowledge in question or the character of the discussion about it. And this means that also, it seems to me, there's a need for us to find ways both in which questions and challenges can be put to specialists by ordinary lay people, but also to find ways in which we can socially entrench our best fallible knowledge so that we don't casually act in ways that it would tell us lead to trouble. And this has really been the big impact on me from Hayek. It isn't that I disagree with Popper's approach to politics, so much as saying that if you take the fact that there may be fallible knowledge about things of this kind, then simply finding things that we all think are dreadful doesn't give us a good approach to politics, because we may be attempting to do things where if we got certain other institutions in place, those will not allow us to address these things in the way in which we want. And so I would take, and it's taken a long time, I would take that as being, as it were, the big corrective to the approach that I got out of Popper, while I still remain a Popperian in my politics, that I got from Hayek. I don't know if that idea is clear.
Yes, I will have to, I'm afraid I will have to read your book in order to understand it completely.
Well, do just ask about it, because I mean, one issue that impressed Hayek himself very much was this. He grew up at a time when he personally favored various Fabian-style ideas about the planning of an economy. And he became convinced by some issues that Ludwig von Mises had raised that actually there was a big problem about this, namely that a market-based economy needed to have certain mechanisms in place if it was going to work, and that what the planners were doing was typically trying to achieve desirable enough things, but in ways that didn't take into account our need to have those mechanisms in place. And so effectively what Hayek was saying was, you either have to show how these things can be achieved in ways that don't stuff up how these mechanisms work, or you have to show us another way in which these aims or goals can be accomplished. And it was this, just as a way of looking at things, as a sort of supplement and corrective to Popper, that seems to me to be really important, but where I see just regularly now governments trying to address issues without asking, okay, if we behave in these sorts of ways, what kind of impact is it going to have on how everything else works? And I take this to be really the crucial, well, a crucial lesson that Hayek emphasizes. And his specific social theories are neither here nor there, but it's this as a sort of check on what I would say is the kind of over-optimism and completely piecemeal approach that one tends to get from liberals and from Popper, that I think is important. But I should further say that, I mean, you had asked me, does this mean I'm a pessimist? And the answer is no. I am an optimist, but I'm an optimist who's learned from what I think the important lessons are that we should learn from Hayek. And this, to me, means that we should learn crucial issues about how we understand the constraints that we're under, and then think of how our institutions can be improved, which is really important, and also to think about whether there are ways in which our goals, like, for example, as Hayek does, a welfare state, which he favors, how could this work, but in ways that don't stuff up the working of other mechanisms that we depend on?
Okay, we will now open the debate for anybody who can ask a question. Yeah, Philip Benes is there. Yes, Philip?
Thank you. So can I just pick up almost immediately on what you have said about Hayek and your relationship with Hayek? And I'm a little, I've got several questions, so I'll perhaps save some for later. But I'm interested that you say that when you started working on this PhD on Hayek's political theory, Popper was not particularly interested, didn't want to engage with you on your research. And please say a little bit more, because clearly Popper and Hayek have a very long relationship going all the way back to 1935 when they first met at the LSE on Popper's initial trip to London. They had corresponded. There was clearly some overlap between science and scientism, the work that Popper, that Hayek produced in the Second World War, published around 1944, Scientism and Society, and Popper's Positive Historicism. So I'm very struck by the fact that Popper, when you come to him with this research agenda, says he appears not to be interested. Now, why?
Well,
this
it's fairly simple. It's fairly simple. I mean, the other people with whom Popper had very close relations, and in many cases then bust-ups, were working on issues which were central to Popper's own intellectual agenda. I was working supervised by Watkins on Hayek, and Popper wasn't working on anything that related to the issues on which I was working. So he had no stake in it. I mean, he was friendly. I mean, he sort of said, well, when Hayek next comes to see me, I'll see if I can get him to meet with you and so on. So he wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't engaged with these things. The second thing I guess I'd say is this. In my view, and I argued this in my little book on Popper, I don't really think that there were very significant influences by Popper on Hayek or by Hayek on Popper. Hayek, I mean, the big issue between Popper and Hayek was essentially that Hayek was able to get the Open Society placed with Routledge, which a publisher who Popper had who kept giving incredibly detailed and pernickety instructions to the people who were helping to try and place the manuscript. He basically said, I don't want it to go to Routledge because Karl Mannheim is the editor of their big series in this area. Hayek had been published by them and was able to get it placed very quickly once he had the okay to try it. Strangely enough, with Herbert Reed, the anarchist who was a Routledge editor at the time. The other thing was that Hayek, editing Economica from Cambridge, was able to place Popper's Poverty of Historicism when an earlier version of it, which we don't have, was rejected by Mind, and where Popper, I think, was feeling increasingly desperate in New Zealand, where he was in the sort of second in a pecking order of two people in a department with a guy who not only didn't share his interests, but who certainly on Popper's account was somewhat deranged. And Popper, I think, was starting to feel in a terrible mess. And Hayek also managed to get a job created at the LSE from the position of a part-time professor in scientific method as a full-time readership. Hayek supported him in this, but though obviously wasn't in a position to appoint him, and I think was just wrote a reference for him and so on, but where from Popper's perspective, Hayek had kind of saved his life from being stuck in New Zealand. And so I think there was this very strong feeling of personal indebtedness. There was a willingness then on the part of both of them to make acknowledgement to one another. But I would take it, for example, that Popper's criticisms of certain kinds of large-scale social planning were totally different in terms of their basis from what one gets in Hayek. There were parallels between them. In a few things they agreed, but their substantive views were very different. And where they were in disagreement, for example, over Hayek's criticisms, which I think were completely correct about ideas about social justice, Popper disagreed, but tended not to do so in public.
Jeremy, I agree, and I like you. I normally would focus on that period, that crucial period of 1943 to 1945, as you have, and certainly the gratitude, the massive gratitude that Popper felt towards Hayek is clear in everything that Popper wrote at that point. However, I would suggest two things. First, there is a very interesting intellectual collaboration that goes along with that. It's not simply a matter of jobs, publications, etc., but it is also that there was, through their correspondence, an increasing recognition that they had similar projects, overlapping projects. And clearly from Hayek's point of view, it's not simply a matter of doing Popper a favor by bringing him to London, but also bringing Popper into a conversation at the LSE, or that Hayek himself was already actively involved in, against other forces on the left or other Keynesian influences, recognizing that Popper himself was a kind of soft Keynesian, that nonetheless Popper's voice would be a useful counter to some of the persons with whom Hayek was already engaged. However, can I add a couple more observations? I think there are two other things. I think we discount too much the closeness of their relationship if we just limit it to that period of 1943 to 45, even though it's larger than I think you give rise to there. And that in particular is clear, I think, in the third part of the Poverty of Historicism, where Popper makes clear reference to key ideas that he credits to Hayek as part of his criticism of utopianism, for example, etc. But once at the LSE, Hayek becomes key to Popper. And when Hayek chooses to leave the LSE, Hayek tries to follow him. I mean, there is this interesting period where Hayek goes off, and before he can take up his position in Chicago, because there's a messy divorce that prevents that occurring immediately, Hayek tries nonetheless to get Popper a job at Chicago. And Popper was so unhappy at the LSE, and so close to Hayek, that he wanted to follow him there. So I think the relationship goes far more than that, far deeper than that. I note that Hayek developed interests that Popper deliberately chose not to replicate, start with a sensory order and his interest in psychology, move on in particular, as you have already mentioned, to Hayek's interesting work on law, constitution of liberty, etc. It is almost as if Popper, out of respect to Hayek, chose not to write in certain areas that Hayek was developing the leading edge in, so to speak. And I feel Popper does us a great disservice by not expanding his thoughts on law. He clearly had many thoughts in embryonic form in the Open Society, but he chooses, given Hayek's background in law, given Hayek's propensity to write on that, to let Hayek fill in that field, whereas a distinct Popperian conception of the rule of law, unfortunately, was not fully articulated or elaborated, to the disadvantage of all of us, I think. So I think there's a greater relationship, even in the 40s to 50s, than you have identified, a greater influence by Hayek on Popper, and possibly the other way around, on Popper on Hayek. But then there is this effective division of labor, especially with regard to writing on law. The very dissertation topic that you chose to write on initially, that Popper declined to comment on. I think that is part and parcel of what I see as that. I have a heck of a lot of other questions that I will save for later.
Can I respond to those?
Can I just also mention one thing? You said my little book on Popper. Jeremy, you're far too modest. Yours is one of the best books and the best sources. So we pray, by hearing you today, I hope we recognize that this is a great contribution. So don't say my little book on Popper. You did well. You did brilliantly. In fact. So
well,
thank you.
That's very kind. I am not sure that I think that Hayek and Popper had, as it were, common enemies. There were people that they both disagreed with. Popper certainly made references to Hayek's work in a rewrite that he did of the final bit of the Poverty of Historicism. I told a bit about the story of that in a little article which talks about their correspondence and so on at the time. The difficulty there is that, as far as I know, we don't have any early versions of the Poverty of Historicism. No, there's no manuscript material. So really, it's difficult to judge much of what was happening. there was an attempt by Hayek to get Popper to the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago, but that didn't go down particularly well. I mean, this was 1950 when I think he'd had an invitation to Harvard to give the William James lectures, and
Yes.
then went on to Chicago. But Strauss and Voegelin were strongly against him, but also Popper was at that point increasingly preoccupied by issues which went into his work on indeterminism in classical and quantum mechanics, and really had his own rather technical agenda of things at the time. He didn't like Hayek's work on the sensory order, and I mean, basically, I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, it was written after I mean, that work of Hayek's goes way back to early days. It then was kind of revived as part of in many ways, misplaced polemic against Neurath and Carnap on the methodology of the social sciences, because he took them to be proponents of physicalism in the sense of a kind of physicalist realism, which wasn't actually their view. But he got back into some of his older arguments from his early work in that context, in his methodological writing. And then this got him excited, and he wrote The Sensory Order as a revision of this. But The Sensory Order is written kind of Wittgenstein Tractatus style, as numbered paragraphs, which makes it pretty much unreadable. But it's also the case that from that Hayek's own starting point was a kind of mix between stuff from Ernst Mach and stuff from work on the brain and psychology that he knew about. And really, from a Popperian perspective, it's actually inductivist. Popper, I think, didn't want to tell him how awful he thought it was, but he got John Eccles, who he knew from New Zealand, to agree to read it over and correspond with Hayek about it. I don't see them as being engaged in common issues. Indeed, what's rather ironic is that Popper agreed to join the Montpellier Society. But in its early stages, Popper's big concern, and this is echoed, I mean, you can see it particularly from the stuff in After the Open Society, the material that he was concerned with at the time was how to try and get a sort of reconciliation between classical liberal people and moderate non-totalitarian socialists. And he was pressing this as an agenda onto Hayek, when actually at the time, Hayek's own agenda was how to get the sort of free marketeers and German conservatives who'd been opponents of Hitler together. And so they were actually talking completely past one another at this point. And while Popper attended these meetings, I think he never really got what Hayek was up to. I mean, either in terms of his kind of vision of how an economy and its associated legal order works, but I think just more generally, I mean, Popper was never sympathetic to economic liberalism as such. I mean, right through his work, there are criticisms of it.
Right, and until maybe towards the end.
I'm not even sure then. I mean, some of his late things, I mean, Popper tends to go on about criticism of laissez-faire, but he never really understands what Hayek was up to in terms of saying, on the one side, you need to have an appropriate system of institutions, and second, that you need to develop, as Hayek tried to do, a system of governmental intervention which wouldn't actually stuff up the workings of the economy and put people's freedom at jeopardy. And so, I mean, he in a sense, I think, never really got what Hayek was trying to argue for.
I'm going to come back at some later point, but just the other point that I had made, you didn't comment on, which is effectively that Popper decides not to do things in areas that Hayek had made primarily his own. So when not only there's no effective development of a Popperian psychology, although Popper was quite well prepared to do that, but more importantly, from my point of view, from the point of view of Popperian political theory, there is no elaboration of a Popperian theory of law or the rule of law.
But my
And
explanation for that, Philip, was really because of the other things he was preoccupied with at the time.
Right.
I mean, Popper was working over that period. I mean, there are two elements to it. I mean, Hayek had a training as a lawyer and always had concerns and background in that area. Popper didn't. The other thing was that Popper was, I mean, basically concerned in his William James lectures, and then in the indeterminism material, and then onto the postscript, in really a kind of an overfull agenda of his own technical work. And he doesn't really, after the writing of the Open Society, do more than occasional pieces on political topics.
I agree. And but I'm going to hold off the rest for later.
Okay, William, it's your turn now.
Yes. Yes, I just wanted to bring up a point that has been made by my wife, who also attended Popper's lectures way back when Jeremy and I were both students at the LSE. And her point is that Popper's conservatism, in the sense of only piecemeal engineering, not wholesale planning and wholesale change, that this is actually a bad idea. And she gives as an example the land reform in Taiwan. Taiwan's land reform was wholesale and transferred land to the peasants who were working it. And in exchange, the rich people got a stake in new industry, which worked out very well. I mean, now Taiwan has twice the income of China and about half of the US. So I just checked. But the point is that this wholesale planning, exactly what Popper is against and Hayek is even more against, and the wholesale change was wise and was successful. So that to be against it in principle is excessively conservative in a bad way, that it does not help society necessarily. It doesn't mean that one shouldn't be cautious about such things, or, you know, that they can't be problems. But in this case, there was a successful wholesale revolution, not gradual.
Okay, can I make a couple of points? First of all, for Popper, piecemeal isn't confined to small scale. I mean, his concern is that it's stuff where if we find that we're getting into big problems, it's possible for us to reverse. The second thing is this: you're able to give a successful example of land reform. There are also various other large-scale experiments in land reform of different kinds, which have been dismal failures. And so I mean, I think what one has to...
Therefore, we shouldn't try.
No. Bill, sorry, there are two separate things. I mean, that's to say, what one mustn't do is just say, oh, we've got a successful example of this, that's enough. What one has to do is to consider, okay, given that there are cases where things work well, and there are other cases where things work miserably. What can we learn from this? Rather than just saying, simply.
But Popper is more conservative. He says that you should always try things first on a small scale. Whereas the point here was not to try it on a small scale, but to try to do it for the whole country, for the whole country of Taiwan, which goes against Popper.
Look, I'm happy enough with your example, but I guess my question to you is, what lesson does one learn from this?
What lesson one learns is that one should not reflexively forbid whole-scale planning and whole-scale change. One must be cautious about it. I agree with you. There are great dangers in it. I mean, both Hayek and Popper, are very well aware of those dangers. And their warnings are well listened to, but not obeyed reflexively. That's my point. My point is there are exceptions, and sometimes there are good arguments against Popper's conservatism, and even more so against Hayek's conservatism.
Well, there are two different kinds of issues. Hayek's concern was with what the mechanisms are going to be with regard to social coordination and so on. And so as far as I can see in the example that you gave was quite interesting, because it was one where there was a positive payoff for the older owners of the land, owners of the land.
Right.
But also, it's presumably the case that in Taiwan, you had both land reform and also pretty good incentive mechanisms being given to the people who then had their own land to do stuff which was useful to the rest of the people in the country and the economy.
Right, it was very well thought out. Yeah.
Yes, but you see, it isn't just a matter of a well thought out plan so much as thinking in terms of what incentives are being given to the different actors in question, so that they will then be able to do the appropriate kind of thing. And I think the key. Yeah, but then I think,
but that does not mean that it doesn't contradict Hayek and Popper.
Well, I'm sorry, but you're not listening. I agreed in respect of Popper, but would say then what one has to do is to learn the appropriate lesson. In terms of Hayek, the key thing for him is the appropriate sorts of social mechanisms that you're using.
No, but he doesn't want planning at all. He's against social planning. He says that any kind of wholesale thing goes to disaster.
Well, look, I'm sorry, but I actually am something of an expert on Hayek and can tell you there are two different kinds of arguments being offered by Hayek. One argument is to say, if you're in a large-scale economy where coordination depends on market relationships, then basically you have to come up with an alternative to how economic activity is going to coordinate if you're going to get rid of those. The second argument, which is from the road to serfdom, is basically that if you have a market economy, then it doesn't make sense to work by introducing a piecemeal level of direction, for example, by saying that landlords should be letting their houses at below market rates and expect the thing still to function. So it doesn't, I mean, what you are, you're raising, I think, an important and interesting point. I think that one has to look in terms of Popper and of Hayek as to what specifically they're arguing for. But my concern, in a sense, is to say, look, you have to be careful just by producing a positive example. I mean, it's a bit like this economist in London with an Italian name who talks about the advantages of governmental entrepreneurship and produces, lots of positive cases. It takes us back to Francis Bacon, whose comment, I think, was roughly, well, you look at the temple and all these kind of honors to the gods made by the sailors who were rescued by the gods at times of peril from the sea, and asking, okay, well, where are the plaques put up by the people who weren't rescued? So one has to look at both sides of it, and then look at the implications for what the arguments are. You can't just go, I mean, I think that it's a genuine and an important case, but you can't just go from that to saying, aha, well, government initiative is vindicated.
No, but it's vindicated in the sense that Popper is refuted, Hayek is refuted. It does not mean that you should always do it. And I did not say that you should always do it. I said in this case, it was successful, and it needs to be done with great caution and with proper incentives and so on and so forth. But my point is simply that this shows that Popper was too conservative in thinking that you should always try things on a small scale, that this was a requirement. The Taiwan success is a contradiction of that, and even more so of Hayek, it seems to me. It doesn't mean you should do it everywhere, and I wasn't advocating it.
Look, I think that there is an issue in relation to Popper, although, as I said, his concern for what is piecemeal doesn't necessarily have to mean small scale. I told you what the two main lines of argument in Hayek were, which just simply don't engage with this issue that you've raised.
Well, I've read, Constitution of Liberty also, and it seemed to me to clearly rule out such kind of things. But anyway, that's a debate for another day.
Okay. It's now Sam, his turn. Sam?
Yes, hello. Thanks for the great talk. I have the following question. So one of the things that I find intriguing about Popper is that he puts incredible emphasis on self-correcting systems. It's both the thing that he appreciates about philosophy of science. His philosophy of science is a self-correcting one where people raise criticisms and correct theories, and also in politics. And I wonder, although I suspect the answer is no, whether he saw this analogy with the market, where, for example, if you have a competitive market, the market is optimizing what we would now call human welfare in modern economics. And that's a kind of self-correcting system. Did Popper see any analogies here between his own philosophy and economics, or was he just unaware of that?
No, and I mean, in broad terms, he was not particularly appreciative of the sort of stuff that gets free market economists excited. He tended first to be sympathetic towards Marxian criticisms of early capitalism and to treat these as if they were historically okay and as if they were somehow the fault of capitalism. Second, he was someone who placed great emphasis on the role of governmental regulation or the need for governmental regulation in the operation of markets. Now here, for example, as compared to Hayek, they weren't on that in any disagreement.
Yeah.
I would tend to say that Popper, it seemed to me, took a grossly over-optimistic view about the behavior of governments. I mean, he tended to think of governments very much after the style of Kantian republicanism, in the sense of if the government will protect, will lay down laws which will protect each individual, accord equality to everyone, and so on. Whereas I personally think that while one may make objections on methodological and substantive grounds to public choice theory, one really needs to look pretty hard at both what the realities are of how politics works, but also on what some of the difficulties are of getting government to do the right thing. And it just seemed to me that these sorts of issues were not ones with which Popper engaged. So I think you can make that kind of argument. I think there's also a sense in which you can draw parallels between what Hayek says about markets as discovery procedures and about the learning element in Hayek's utopia and Popper's approach. But he, to my knowledge, had really neither knowledge of nor sympathy for any of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, to me, it seems like they're very compatible worldviews, although respectively, it seems like they also didn't have much overlap in how they thought about this.
Yeah,
so like,
I tend to think of Popper as being at heart much more of a kind of, in some ways, quite radical social democrat.
yeah.
And that while there were parallels with Hayek, I'd see these as very often being matters of disagreement with some of the other people who were around at the time, rather than there being common bedfellows, as it were.
Yeah, well, there's the difference between them as people and their idiosyncratic opinions about things, and also their philosophies. And I think on their philosophies or their theories, or however you want to call it, are much more compatible than their kind of interactions seem to suggest. But
I'm suspicious along the grounds that I indicated to Phil when he was questioning me before about this.
I have one other question, which I think I can keep fairly brief, but you said that Hayek would favor a something like welfare. I think I remember reading something to that extent in Road to Serfdom, but I also have the feeling that Hayek was kind of had reservations as well, that these kinds of policies were things which he was not uncritical of, that he would say, you know, it's difficult to plan these kinds of things. It's and also it would pollute the way in which the monetary system is used. Like the monetary system has a very specific purpose, which is to signal information to people in the market, and using money for welfare pollutes that kind of signaling. And I wonder, yeah, if that's right, or if I'm wrong in that respect.
No, it seems to me that Hayek is, I mean, it's kind of odd. The young Hayek, I think, would have emotionally sympathized with it. At the time of the Road to Serfdom and of the Montpellier Society, he kind of says yes to a welfare state, but sort of wants to make sure that it doesn't create economic disincentives. By the time you get to law, legislation, and liberty, he offers quite an interesting line of argument which parallels something that one actually gets in Hegel's philosophy of right. Namely, the idea that in earlier social formations, people had extended families who would be in a position to provide welfare for them. When you get to a more mobile and atomized society, then really there is a responsibility on the part of government to pick up these responsibilities. So the big difficulty I think that Hayek gets into is, it seems to me that he has no, I mean, once he admits this, it's not clear that he's got any very clear guiding line as to what the character of this thing should be, who should owe what to whom, does one put checks on it when there is an overall problem for the economy, and what, as Mises objected at the first Montpellier Society, what basically about the starving people over the border. And so it seems to me that it fits Hayek's own approach. I mean, he's got nothing in principle against this if a country can afford it. He doesn't, I think, have a principled account of it. What he wants to do is to find ways to accomplish such purposes that don't stuff up the workings of a market economy or provide problematic limits on people's liberty. But I just don't think that he ever gets into really in detail what this would amount to and what the principles of it should be. I mean, there's a bit of discussion in Constitution of Liberty, but I think it's a problem area for him.
Great, thanks. That was very enlightening.
Thank you. Now it's Brian has turn.
So, Jeremy, do you have any comments on what Popper wrote in The Communist Road to Self-Enslavement, where he says he's accepted a number of Mises's theorems, and I think I corresponded with you briefly about that. I asked you about this once before, and you said you didn't have any insight. Is there any explanation for this?
No, I am highly skeptical about it, just in the following terms. It was something that Popper was writing very late on in his life. I haven't seen any other account. I mean, I don't know, and I would need to go back and to see if Malachi has come across anything and if his biographer has come up with anything. I don't know anything about Popper's interactions with Mises, and he, I mean, in a strange way, a big difference between Popper and Hayek was that Popper was in no sense part of the Mises circle. And so the only other thing I'd say about it is that Popper had an uncle, the chap who was responsible apparently for cutting a lot of material from the logic of scientific discovery. And this guy was a statistician and economist who actually came down on the other side of the socialist calculation debate from Mises, and eventually, I think, became a communist. And eventually he fled to England. Now, he seems to have had, in some ways, quite close relations with Popper because he helped with the cutting of the book. On the other side of it, I think Popper found this guy's transition to the radical left a little bit difficult to take. But I don't see any, Popper, I think, had some role. I'm just trying to think where I got this stuff from, that Popper had apparently persuaded him to take one section out of a book that he wrote about a socialist economy. But I don't think, I don't know of any sign that there is any of any contact with Mises. And it's quite striking that the material to be found in The Poverty of Historicism was material where he was keen to acknowledge points and work with them being made by Hayek rather than by Mises. So I just don't know there to be any backstory to this. If anyone comes across it, I would really be fascinated. But my own reaction is there has to be a big question mark about about this particular very late stuff.
Right. Well, I asked the Grove City College has
You're
Mises's
muted,
archives.
I think, or not speaking.
Oh, sorry.
You're
I
not-
think I'm unmuted. I'm
you're
unmuted.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I inquired with the Grove City College has Mises's papers, and I asked the archivist if there were any references to Popper, and there was only some. The only thing about Popper was the inclusion of some paper that a talk that Popper had given at the Mont Pelerin Society. So there was no comment on that end. So it's an interesting question.
Okay. We can go back to Philip now.
Thanks. Just on that last point that Brian was raising, if you look at that 1992 essay, which initially was a speech given in January at the American Economic Association, and then was expanded and repeated and expanded at a commemoration of after Hayek's death at the LSE. So both the panel for the American Economic Association 1992 conference, which was on basically Hayek's theory and was a commemoration of Hayek, and then the subsequent event was really this very emotionally laden reflection on Hayek's importance. And you would be remiss in mentioning Hayek without at least saying something in passing on von Mises. But what does he say about von Mises? And I think you're right, Brian, that he acknowledges von Mises as having great insight. But he also sees von Mises as viewing Popper. I mean, this is Popper's own representation of this as the great rival, so to speak, for Hayek's friendship. So Popper suggests that he and von Mises were in some sort of presumably platonic love triangle for influence over Hayek and winning Hayek to their side. And he, I think, if I recall, Popper indicates that he got the better of that. But yeah, but it's so minimal passing observations on von Mises, just acknowledging how important this was. It's the only occasion I can find in the entirety of Popper's work where he seems to take the calculation theory as important as it should be seen, rather than kind of a background reference to other Austrian economics or Austrian economists. And usually there he's referring to von Barak, I think, rather than von Mises. For example, in the footnotes to the relevant chapter in the Open Society and its enemies, there's no direct reference to von Mises. But yeah, so that's a passing reference. It's largely, I think, because of the passing of Hayek that occurs in. It seems
if
to me,
I might just interject quickly.
Yes.
So I would completely agree if he didn't say, I accept some of his theorems.
yes,
Some of his most basic theorems, which is,
yes,
that's kind of wild.
I think it is, and I think it's rather too late for him to have said that, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if he had only said something like that, I think his criticisms, if you look at the Open Society's enemies, his criticisms of the labor theory of value, while they are brilliant in and of themselves, would have been so much better if they had incorporated an acknowledgement of the calculation debate and the von Mises's insight. So I think it's rather too late, too little, too late. But you're right; it is somewhat wild. Popper was 90 years old at that time. There were some things he wrote and presented at the very end of his life that do not seem entirely consistent with how he earlier presented them. But on that particular point, like with Brian, I think it would be much more useful if he had been able to bring himself to acknowledge Mises's contribution earlier. Is that okay, Brian, or can I make another point? Okay, thanks. Regarding what Bill Berkson had said, I think, interestingly enough, not only does Popper recognize that piecemeal, what he called piecemeal social engineering, which I think is a really unfortunate term to begin with, the idea that we engineer as if we are technicians of superior status to the rest of the population, engineering from above. I always find that term rather uncomfortable, especially when associated with a liberty-promoting political theory as Popper's is. It doesn't seem to go with that, but there is room for quite large-scale efforts in terms of Keynesian intervention in Popper's Open Society and its enemies, in terms of massive breaking up of trusts and monopolies, and those sorts of things are consistent with Popper's understanding. But the other thing that I think you have is that Popper is coming out of a legacy of Marxism. He was for many years, to a very substantial extent, a Marxist, or Marxian, maybe we should say, a Marxian socialist, up until perhaps 1935, as he was a Marxian socialist, and he remained identifying himself as a socialist until much later than that as well. But you have a sense in which very large scale changes may well be recognized in the past, and in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, there would be substantial changes. And that is really the kind of change that occurred, I think, in Taiwan, breaking up the latifundist, the large landed estates, and empowering the peasants as participants within a capitalist economy. That he tended to treat that as a benign, albeit very large scale development. What he was most concerned with in his statements on piecemeal social engineering was the wrong-headed efforts of certain romantic and left groups who wanted to have a utopia that would restructure society as a whole according to some utopian notions. That's of a very different scale and a very different sort of wholesale social engineering than the types of adjustments to feudal societies that became rapidly transitioned to modern largely capitalist societies, as occurred in Taiwan. So I think that's a very different element there. What I think Popper's writings on piecemeal social engineering was very largely part of his efforts to reform the left, to enable the left to be more self-restrained, with the expectation that if they could restrain their utopian proclivities, they would be much more successful and much more effective in introducing progressive social change. So that's just that bit. I have a couple of other things that I will come back to whenever people have exhausted their things, but I want to tackle certain aspects of your book, Jeremy, if I may, but that can wait until later.
Can I just mention, you know, the question of whether the Taiwan thing contradicts Popper, I think depends on a close reading of Popper, which is for another time.
Maybe we can change now to Tom Nassus and afterwards come back. Is that okay for you, Brian? Brian? I don't hear you.
I'm sorry, my hand's still up and I don't want to, that's
okay
fine.
if we go to Tom Nassus now and we return and okay, Tom?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, very quickly, just a quick question. I'm clearly not as have an in-depth understanding of Karl Popper or his political philosophy compared to a lot of the people on this call. I am definitely a fan though. And I was just wondering, Jeremy, if you would like to comment, if it's possible, given your deep understanding of Karl Popper and your relationship with him, if it's possible to kind of project maybe a general observation about the state of affairs in terms of technology, where we're at today. I mean, the world in Popper's time versus the world today is quite different. So on the side of in terms of technology, in terms of the culture wars that we talk about, and then in terms of just the populism that has evidently been growing quite rapidly these last few years in terms of the right and the left. Just some general observations from Karl Popper. If he was here with us, what might he say?
Hello, Jeremy, are you still there? Jeremy, did he disappear?
Hello.
Hello, Jeremy.
Hello.
Hello, Jeremy. Did you hear the question?
Yes.
Okay, it's your turn now.
Yes. There is something I think that Popper says, which is rather interesting relating to this, when he talks about something that he refers to as our being in a fatherless society. He depicts essentially a collapse of authority over time. And he seems to be quite sanguine about this, but under roughly 3 conditions: that we should be concerned about truth, that we should be fallibilists and realize that we need to learn from one another, and indeed that we are willing to have interchanges with and learn from other parties. Now, I think that the big problem that we face is that those conditions have started to disappear. And I would say in passing that Kasanstein's #Republic seems to me to put his finger on a lot of significant problems. I mean, in part, that the tradition that he really likes in America, and which is continuous with Popper's concern, is one where we do admit our fallibility and that we're willing to learn from one another. And it seems to me in some ways that the real tragedy at the moment is that people both on the left and on the right are kind of behaving as if because they feel strongly about things, not only shouldn't they be questioned, but that somehow it's an assault on them if people raise critical points. Another issue that Sunstein points to is the way in which one can draw on literature on in social psychology, which points out in a certain sense just how difficult it is for us to behave in the kind of way that Popper was suggesting. It doesn't come at all naturally to us. But I think, too, one could say that the way in which social media has developed has, in many respects, exacerbated all of this by essentially encouraging people not only to follow their natural tendencies just to want confirmations from one another, but where they're also given incredible incentives by social media and other companies to produce things that in one way or another confirm their prejudices for reasons of commercial exploitation, as it were, rather than behave in the kind of way in which Popper was suggesting. And it seems to me that the situation is pretty dire, and that really there is a slightly different task in front of us to the one that Popper himself was confronting, namely, how can we rebuild institutions which will get us to learn from one another in a Popperian style, both on a face-to-face basis, but also on a virtual basis.
Thank you.
Somebody else? Otherwise, I will ask a question if nobody else. Adam Chmielewski could not be with us. Oh, yes, Brian, you have a priority.
I just wanted to ask Jeremy, in the book, you mentioned, I think, kind of a federation of liberal societies. And I wonder if you're in communication with or have talked with Chandran Koukouthis on his liberal archipelago?
I know Chandran quite well, and I think that we had in some ways similar ideas. I guess I would say that there is a kind of twist in this, because I think if one looks at Popper's work, there is in it not only a hostility to nationalism, but a certain kind of feeling that actually it was a terrible shame that the Habsburg Empire broke up. I would actually enhance this very strongly and say that it seems to me that that kind of structure, and similarly the Ottoman Empire reformed, is much better than what we have at the moment, just on the grounds that within such settings, one could have effectively substantive multiculturalism with different groups doing things, but where they're encouraged then to talk with one another and to engage in Popper-style discussions. It suddenly struck me, however, that actually one might look at a rebuilding of these kind of structures by way of the development of the EU, because this gives one, in a certain sense, exactly the kind of dilution of ideas about sovereignty and the putting of blocks. I mean, it doesn't work as effectively as it might if one thinks of the example of Hungary, but the certain kind of blocks on what rabid nationalists can do of a sort which we didn't have before. And I think that for, amongst other reasons, it is a terrible shame that Britain left, but that one might move not just within that kind of structure for a situation where you have EU level things and a kind of rather basic uniform framework, but uniform laws and so on, and national occurrences, but it might actually be developed to give reasonable space to what one could otherwise call national minorities. And I think that, I mean, it's a wild idea, but I think that the kind of situation that we are in at the moment is a very tricky one in individual national countries.
Well, I think that in the early United States, with the socialist utopian experiments, that we had that kind of environment here as well. And I wonder also if there isn't a little bit of hubris at the EU that maybe the Habsburgs didn't have, that they could decide whether or not Englishmen can heat their water with inductive kettles or not.
Look, there are certainly problems, but it seems to me that in an odd sense, this does give an alternative to the kind of structure that we have, whereas I really get disturbed at the moment by the way in which both nationalism, but also kind of liberal regulatory regimes can end up being incredibly intolerant. I was talking to someone recently who came from a background in Rudolf Steiner. And I don't know if you know of the Steiner schools or Waldorf schools.
Right.
And they have their own distinctive and, I would say, from the outside, often rather nutty seeming ways of doing things. But apparently some of these have been closed down by the school regulatory authorities in Britain. And in a similar kind of way, evangelical and conservative Muslim groups who don't like the particular line on education of children on sexual mores that are at odds with their views are getting into a whole lot of problems. And it seems to me that we really, even if we dislike the views in question, have to do what we can to, within protections, but of a gentle character, encourage diversity, but encourage dialogue so we can actually learn from one another.
Yeah, I agree.
And now we have Jerry Chandler, who wants to ask a question.
Yes, so I would like to expand out the scope of meaning a little bit. The conversation is focused more on the economic aspects and its relationship to the hard sciences. But in the early part of the discussion, the issues revolving around your own background, Jeremy, in particular, you said chemistry and logic, catalyzed my thinking about how you might have wandered from those initial interests all the way to your present viewpoints, particularly with regard to emergence and that sort of thing. Within this context, I was struck by the relationship between Hayek's notion of sensory order and the more or less ignoring of this notion of sensory order by Popper. I was wondering if you have views here on the significance of particularly semiotics and the relationship between languages and these particular, shall we say, artificial constructs.
The answer is you have referred to various things about which I am very badly ignorant. All I guess I can say is that, on my understanding, Popper's view about both knowledge and psychology was very strongly biological in its approach. And I think that this was one of the very significant reasons why he didn't like the kind of thing that Hayek was doing in his sensory order. I mean, if one looks at the correspondence between them, Hayek is, in a sense, repeatedly asking Popper, please will you read and give me comments on the sensory order? And Popper keeps giving excuses. And I think that he really didn't like it at all. And I've given a brief indication before as to why I think he didn't like that sort of approach. I think there were many strands to it.
Do you think one of the primary contributions here to Popper's rejection of this viewpoint would be the intimate intertwining of the geometry with quantum mechanics and a very local view of things, as compared with the breadth of the sensory order?
No, I mean, basically
on geometry.
No, I mean, basically Popper had a background in psychology in which he was very close to and also influenced by members of the Würzburg school. While he moved away from that when he was talking about psychological matters and in some respects epistemological matters, he often referred back to the kind of approach to psychology of a biological character which they had, which I think was just on very different lines from Hayek's. I also, as I indicated before, think that from Popper's perspective, Hayek's approach was actually inductivist, and I think that he really thought that it was hopeless, but that he didn't want to engage with him on something to which Hayek was obviously very deeply attached.
Then one final question, I guess, from my own perspective again, which is obviously come from a very radically different direction than your own thinking. But this, you mentioned your interest in chemistry and the ability and the notions of the atomic table of elements as being foundational to the natural sciences has a different form of logic than physical logic, or particularly physical logic in general, and particularly the relationship to geometry is radically different in chemical logic than it is from a mathematical or metaphysical points of view based on the natural sciences. So was this play any role in the way that confirmation of theories is constructed in chemistry versus confirmation of theories as in physics, or in your view of Hayek's work?
No, there are two separate things going on here. On the one side, there is my personal intellectual background, where I studied chemistry to the point where I think I could have gone on to university to study it, but didn't. And I then did a little bit of work on the history of chemistry. But this has nothing whatever to do with Popper. The other thing that I'd say is that just personally, I found chemistry fascinating just because one had an explanatory structure within it where one got to know all sorts of things about the surface properties of different kinds of things, and then was able to find different layers of explanations in depth as to what was responsible for that. By contrast with that, I studied mathematics up to material at first-year university level, including foundations of mathematics, and I found it intellectually impossible. I just was given essentially a whole variety of different separate tasks, the interrelationships within which, to which never became clear in any way, and I just found studying mathematics utterly unsatisfactory. And that somehow, if one had been given a kind of how can I put it? If you got a sort of Principia Mathematica and then more deep level of understanding of mathematics, which you could then use to explain all sorts of other things in mathematics, that would be good. But I never found anything like this on offer. And just, I mean, it was possibly in terms of my own ineptitude, but I just found it up there with economics, as that was taught initially, to be utterly intellectually unsatisfying.
Thank you. You identified quite well some of our mutual motivations for pursuing intellectual history. Thank you.
May I now? There are two people, I think, who want to ask a question. Temba, who raised his real hand. You want to ask a question? And Margareta. Hello, Temba. You have to unmute, Temba. And you have to click on unmute. Yes, you want to ask something?
Yes, how are you? Good evening to the rest of the group. I'm in South Africa, so I think this side is very late at night. I'm not sure what's happening with the rest of the world. But yeah, I have a question or a few questions. They may not be relevant for the type of discussions that you're having now, but I would like to know something. When you can talk at the level of intellect that you're talking now about, I would think, very important things that would make it, maybe make the world a better place. What happens to the ordinary man who gets to fight and get into a position of power, whom decide on a lot of things for us? That would be a politician, that would be a government employee in high position, who generally does not have an interest in philosophy. Is philosophy kept separate from daily conversations intentionally?
Howard.
I'm sorry,
No?
you were interrupted. Yes.
What I want to understand is the type of discussions that you're having now. I would think if the layman had some understanding of it, let's say even 10% of what you people know, the world would somehow be a better place, even less than 10% of what you know.
Or a worse place, possibly.
So my question becomes, how do we package this type of knowledge in a way that can be comprehended by almost, okay, less than 10% of the people I know. Okay, there are two types of people. There are people who fight for knowledge. There are people who fight for power. And those who fight for power generally don't have much knowledge. And what I'm trying to understand is there a way of packaging this information in such a way that it would be interesting for them? Because I think they just run with what they have, and ultimately they make the world a worse place than it is. The politics of my country, generally, I watch sometimes, and even the debates are not at a level where it could be interesting, let alone even finding solutions. So I see a very big gap between what I know. By the way, I didn't study philosophy at university. I've only been reading materials that I get maybe sometimes on the internet. And I think and believe that if I could somehow learn to package some of what I know into something that they could maybe absorb, you know, at least to start thinking about, how would one go about such a thing? And I think also knowledge or philosophy, or the love of knowledge, does not have very good marketing, you know. Right now we are talking, I think there's probably not very many groups like this all over. And I would think that whatever we are talking about now is very critical. How do you then market the type of information that is being shared on this group so that you can reach a wider audience? Even if it's not like very old people, you could maybe start even in high schools teaching philosophy there. But how do you make the information more exciting for people? Because now when we're discussing it at this level, for me it works, but the people that need to hear it the most are not on this group.
Well,
I think
that is your question. Yes, yeah. We'll wait for his answer.
Shall I have a go? Look, I think there are different things that I'd say. First of all, one might say we've been talking about both Popper and Hayek. If one's concerned with ordinary people, Hayek's big interest is in having structures in which people can make use of their skills, know-how, and knowledge in ways that work to the benefit of their fellow citizens. The second kind of theme is one in Popper, where he says, look, it's really important for us to get critical input from anyone into the improvement of our decisions. Few of us are going to be in a situation where we can design institutions or policies. Pretty much anyone might know of ways in which policies that are planned or policies that are implemented might be harmful in ways that people hadn't expected to them or to people whom they know. And so at a practical level, I would say that if people are interested in these discussions, something that becomes really pressing is to try to think of how we can make institutions which can give ordinary people an input in these sorts of ways. But how do we do that? Well, clearly, if people are interested in power, they are not likely to spend their Sundays listening to discussions like this. There may, though, be two things that one can do. First of all, I remember a discussion that I was having with some people in Hong Kong. And what we were discussing was true enough then, and I think it's even more pressing now, which is that there is, I think, an important case for getting together think tanks, not pressing a particular ideological line, but where people are engaging in discussion in ways that suggest how practical problems that the government is currently facing might be addressed. And where the people in Hong Kong that I was talking to were skeptical. They said, nah, I mean, anyone who is engaged in that kind of activity would be taken simply to be trying to make money for themselves and to exercise political influence. And my view is that what one needs to do is to think of ways in which one can constitute such groups in a manner that makes it pretty transparent that one's only concern in these matters is with getting better outcomes, with getting better design. Because clearly, if people are in positions of power, it is better for them if they're ruling over a thriving economy rather than ruling over a dunghill. And so they have a kind of practical interest in the government actually flourishing and doing things that are sensible, rather than they're just exercising power and doing deals with crooks who then systematically rob everything. So I don't imagine that the people with power would have any interest in joining in such discussions, but it seems to me that one might think of ways in which one could spin off groups, and particularly groups which contain people who have different perspectives, and where you might say, well, if they have different perspectives, they won't agree about anything. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because while they may not convince one another, they may, for example, be able to agree that if we have a particular institution in place, then it's better to do things this way rather than that way, even if, given their own opportunity, one of them would like to privatize everything, another one would like to nationalize everything, and another one would like just to put everything in the hands of the members of his tribe or friends or whatever. So it seems to me that one could look at these things both in terms of what contribution can be made by ordinary people, but then to think in terms of what institutions might be able to make some input. And hey, with Zoom and the internet, it doesn't actually cost anything. I mean, I've run conferences, and I don't know if you're getting an institution to help out with this, Margareta, but I mean, basically, you can, for just about nothing, run discussions like this and write things up. So there are all sorts of possibilities of pursuing such an agenda. That would be my response. I don't know if it's of any help to you.
Okay, now it's Margarita, her turn, I think. But we are almost at the end of our time.
Yes, so I'll try to keep it very short. So first, it's all volunteer run out of the love of our heart, or I don't know what the expression is, out of the bottom of our heart, that we find is important. I couldn't resist, and I apologize if I put my foot in my mouth, but I heard Jerry talking about that Popper somehow had ignored Hayek. But actually, there is an article just about the sensory order. There is an article in Jeremy and I think we have talked about this. It maybe is not well known, but it is there. Conjectures and Refutations, an article about the language and the body-mind problem. And there are actually two scholars, Ed Feser and Jack Berner, and they both studied what happened when Popper wrote that article. And Ed Feser takes Popper's side and Jack Berner takes Hayek's side. And it is Popper in the most plain language possible telling that he doesn't believe there is anything useful about the machine metaphor. And he's kind of trying to say to Hayek, you're kind of thinking like a machine. You're falling in the trap of cybernetics to think it's useful to anthropomorphize your machines and then think of yourself a machine. And at Faeser, he's pointing that out. What Hayek does, he develops a classification system, but he doesn't really do anything further with his sensory order. So that he goes in a direction, so he may have the perfect classification system, but then, so what do you do with it? He can't answer it. And Popper is trying to say the argumentative function that assumes not a perfect classification system, but a feedback feed-forward system. And so Popper is trying to argue that with this fourth argumentative function. And I'm going to stop in a minute, but to connect to what excuse me for a moment, what Temba said, the thing that he also brings up is the three-world hypothesis. And a way to think about that is a schema of distinctions. So the Popper is kind of trying to say, and that's the way I understand it, we need to think about the schemas of distinctions that we use to communicate, and we need to start in school to teach children to think about their schemas, and then we can talk with each other if we kind of look at our schemas and figure out whether they're similar or not. And that's a way that we can solve problems. And then indeed, as Jeremy said, the ones that are kind of total involved with power, they have a different schema, and you see it clearly. And perhaps we can contain them, but we need to be aware of our own schema. And now I'll let Jeremy answer or give feedback to what I just said.
Well, if I could comment, look, I was going on the basis of the correspondence between Popper and Hayek concerning the sensory order, where, as I was indicating, Hayek was asking Popper for an evaluation and he ducked it. It's undoubtedly, it is though the case that Popper threw out some comments, and one can find Hayek actually addressing a number of these in work that he did subsequent to the sensory order. But my view of the thing is really that Popper just didn't like the approach, but as he did quite generally in terms of Hayek, for personal reasons, pulled his punches and didn't want to get into fights with Hayek about stuff where they seriously disagreed.
There is one person who wants to ask another question, Steve Frank. Yes.
Well, just a comment more than anything, since I may be the one philosopher type who would spend a Sunday that is actually active in politics. I can give you a lot more background in what is going on than the analysis that has been given. But I will tell you that one of the beauties of democracy, I was a mayor here in the city of Covington, population 40,000, is that you have to knock on about 5,000 doors to get elected, and you find out what's actually going on in people's minds. Now, you get a lot of feedback and you learn a lot about your town, and there's lots of little areas that have completely different concerns than maybe the entire town or the region. And you have to interact with people from the counties and the state and the federal government. And there's different tidal forces going on between all of these. But the one thing that I have found common at the local, county, state, federal level is that the elected people in many cases are not the ones in particular charge. I don't care what your system is. There's a group of people that sit below that are the quote unquote expert class that try to, well, as I had a frank conversation once with a city manager that he does whatever he has to talk, to the point that we wouldn't fire him, but otherwise it's his show. the elected people are there more for window dressing, I think, is the attitude in a lot of these organizations, which is why you probably had Brexit. The people in England were probably saying these folks in Brussels weren't listening to us. Quite often maybe the guys in Brussels knew what was going on more than, what was best in the long-term scheme of all that was great for Europe or the world. But sometimes there's particularisms of a locality. Where I am in Northern Kentucky, we see the world very differently than the rest of the state. Where, we have our own window on things, and you have to sometimes play a bit of poker with other regions to get your way. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is the politics in theory and politics in action can be two different things, and that I do believe that there's a lot that one can learn from being philosophical and learning the traditions. I mean, really the whole point, I think originally when I was reading The Myth of the Framework, was that you can come and understand people who come from completely different ideological backgrounds. I was more of a transactional guy. I was trying to get things done versus coming at things from a real ideology. But you can come to understand and sometimes use logic to persuade people, usually by trying to show them that if you listen to me, you're going to get what you want. People generally don't vote against their own self-interest. Now, that also means really, like in the case of a gentleman living in a country where maybe there is no feedback, the people are in there just for the power. And I know people like that too, and even in democratic governments. But there's always a feedback loop. There's a point past which even Putin can't press. They even dictators know that there are limitations up to a point until they maybe sometimes cross a line. I guess that's my point.
Thanks very much.
Okay, then we are now into the next session, smoothly rolling over, and the next session is remembering Jeremy. Okay, let me begin.
I'm just waving goodbye.
Yeah,
thank you all very much.
Wait a minute, Jeremy, that we do a proper goodbye. So for those of you who don't have Jeremy's email address, you just send an email to karlpopper@gmail.com, and I'll make sure you get all the contact information that Jeremy wants me to share. Then Jeremy, as you know, twice a year there's a Popper conference, and there's also lectures. Some of them are already online, and again at our karlpopper.net website you will find all the details. And so thank you again. Jeremy has been with us from the beginning, from the first meet and greet that we had in 2021, and we'll see you again, I guess, at the next one.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much.